Are you sure you are who you think you are? Or are you living within a carefully constructed identity, shaped by fears, traumas, and others' expectations? What if your self is merely an adaptation, a reflection of unconscious patterns repeated with the illusion of freedom? Maybe what you call will is just a programmed reaction. Maybe what you believe to be destiny is just the unconscious operating in silence. In this video, you'll dive into layers of the human psyche that rarely come to light. You'll understand how the shadow, complexes, persona, and synchronicity shape your reality without you even noticing. And perhaps you'll discover that true freedom isn't about having control, but about reconciling with everything you've tried to forget, including and especially yourself. But be warned, this isn't content for those looking for quick answers. It's for those brave enough to ask questions that change everything. Because here we don't offer certainties. We open portals. You don't live your life, you live what's been programmed into you. It sounds like a harsh provocation, but look closely. How many of your choices were born from pure spontaneity? And how many were just predictable responses to an invisible structure? Since birth, we are shaped by external voices, parents, culture, school, religion, traumas, and that creates such a familiar internal architecture that we call it self, without realizing it's a construct. A domesticated self, operating on invisible tracks, convinced that it's free. The decisions we make, on our own, are actually responses shaped by deep layers of conditioning. Childhood imprints codes on us that repeat in adulthood with eerie precision. A missed compliment, a silent rejection, conditional affection. Every detail becomes an unconscious script. The freedom of choice we value so highly can often be just a well-told illusion. As Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life. And you will call it fate. The shadow begins to act right there, in the blind spot of consciousness. It's not what we hide. It's what we don't even know exists within us. A rage we swear we don't have, a desire we deny with morality, a pain disguised as sarcasm. The shadow lives in automatic gestures, impulsive judgments, emotional addictions we repeat. And the more we deny its presence, the more it shows up in distorted ways. Living without acknowledging it is like trying to drive a car without knowing there's a hole in the brake. That's why self-knowledge isn't a pretty journey of discovering talents. It's a process of deprogramming, painful, revealing, liberating. It's having the courage to doubt what we call self. True freedom doesn't begin when we do what we want, but when we begin to understand who this want is that drives us. And maybe then something more authentic, more profound will emerge. Something that wasn't taught, but has always been there, waiting to be remembered. Everything you reject in yourself hides behind behaviors you consider normal. And that's one of the great ironies of the psyche. The more we deny a part of ourselves, the more it finds subtle, and sometimes even socially acceptable, ways to express itself. Pride disguised as self-confidence. Envy masked as critical thinking. Fear camouflaged as caution. We create layer upon layer of justification to avoid confronting what we really feel. And who we really are. The shadow is not just a repository of repressed evil. It also holds your stifled potential, unlived talents, forgotten passions, silenced truths. It's like fertile land that was never cultivated, where both weeds and rare flowers grow. When you reject your most visceral emotions, you're not just avoiding problems. You're cutting off entire parts of your creative, intuitive, instinctive power. The shadow is not your enemy. It's the part of you that got left behind. The big trap is that we spend our lives trying to seem like good people. But being good, in the deepest sense, means integrating who you are, not hiding it. Nietzsche said, "What one loves most in oneself must be punished." And that quote challenges us because it exposes how much we deny the most vital parts of ourselves. Every behavior we repeat without reflection might be covering up a piece of our shadow. And as long as it's ignored, it will continue to guide us from the edges of awareness. There is no real growth without going through this darkness. And that takes humility, to recognize that what you hate in others might just be a reflection of what you haven't accepted in yourself. The shadow is the most honest mirror you can have. It doesn't lie, it doesn't pretend, it doesn't flatter. Just waits. Waits for you to be ready to stop running. And finally start listening. How many versions of yourself were created just to please others? The persona you show isn't a mistake, it's a strategy. From an early age, we learned that certain behaviors generate affection, approval, belonging. So we wear masks. Some work so well that we forget they're masks. They become identity. They become part of the character we play to be loved, respected, accepted. But the soul knows, and the body feels, because there's a deep exhaustion in sustaining a version of yourself that isn't whole. The danger isn't in wearing masks. The problem begins when we forget we're wearing one. The persona is useful, even necessary. It helps organize our social interactions, allows us to play roles in the world. But it should be fluid, not a prison. When the mask sticks to the skin, we lose touch with what moves us inside. We laugh when we don't want to laugh, say yes when the body screams no, follow plans that aren't ours. Until one day the emptiness hits hard. The psyche is wise but subtle. It starts with little discomforts, a vague dissatisfaction, an unexplainable lethargy, a restlessness that won't go away. Slowly what was swallowed begins to seek air. And that's when many hit a crisis, because the collapse of the persona feels like the end of the world. But it's actually the beginning of a reunion. A reunion with authenticity, with desire, with unspoken truth. A process of distilling the soul. Being authentic isn't saying everything you think, nor living without filters. It's knowing how to differentiate what is genuine expression from what is unconscious performance. It's reclaiming the right to be multiple without getting lost. To adapt without abandoning yourself. To engage with the world without dissolving into it. When you remember that you're wearing a mask, it loses the power to control your life. And in that space of clarity, something that is uniquely yours begins to emerge. Your truth. Your old traumas still operate as living forces within you. No matter how much time passes, the unconscious doesn't forget. A word that wounds you, a silence that bothers you, a situation that seems trivial. Anything can trigger a psychological complex formed long ago, in an experience you might not even remember. These complexes are like autonomous emotional cores. When activated, they take control. And suddenly, you react like a frightened child, even with the appearance of a well-adjusted adult. The ego tries to take charge, of course. It sees itself as the captain of the ship, the one in control of decisions. But there are older, stronger, deeper undercurrents. The unconscious has its own plans, and it acts silently, operating its invisible gears behind every choice, every fear, every impulse. That's why sometimes you ask yourself, why did I do that again? Because it wasn't your conscious you who decided. It was the program running in the background without your awareness. Jung called this complex possession. And that's exactly what it is. A part of you temporarily takes over. You say things you didn't mean to say, feel things you can't control, sabotage relationships you wanted to keep. It's a silent battle between what you want and what was imprinted on you by the past. Free will in this scenario is partial. You can choose. As long as you know who's doing the choosing. And that awareness only comes when you face those ghosts head-on. Understanding your complexes is not a theoretical task, it's an emotional journey. It takes courage to revisit memories, to name old pains, to recognize the wounded child still living within you. Only then can the ego stop fighting for control and begin to dialogue with the unconscious. Not to dominate it, but to integrate it. Because real strength isn't about repressing your shadows, but about knowing when it's them speaking through you. Others activate in you parts you've tried to bury. Every relationship is a collision of unconscious minds, which is why often loving hurts more than hating. What you haven't worked through within yourself will seek expression in the gaze of another. And it's no use rationalizing attraction, jealousy, discomfort, anger. All of that has deep roots. No one wounds us exactly. They just touch wounds that were already there, merely asleep. Every intense passion hides an archetype. An idealized inner model, often unconscious, that we project onto the other. That explains why we fall in love so quickly, so irrationally. We're not seeing the person, we're seeing a psychic image that responds to an ancient longing. At the same time, every conflict brings a repressed lesson to the surface. Behind every unresolved argument is a part of you begging to be heard, understood, integrated. This mirror dance can be painful, but it's also a rare chance for self-awareness. When someone deeply irritates you, ask yourself, what is this person revealing that I don't want to see in myself? When someone completely enchants you, ask yourself, what am I projecting here that I haven't yet recognized as mine? Relational life, in this sense, is not just about coexisting, it's a psychic laboratory. Every encounter is a summons for your own internal meeting. That's why the most challenging relationships are often the most transformative. Not because the other has something special, but because they activate what's been dormant in you. When we stop demanding that the other complete us, we begin to realize how much we've been fragmenting ourselves. And maybe, in this mutual recognition of imperfections, we can start to truly love, not for the fantasy, but for the truth that emerges from the friction. Jung believed that certain random events are symbolic reflections of your psyche. He called this synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence, revealing a mysterious connection between the inner world and the outer world. You think of someone you haven't seen in years, and they appear. You find a book that answers a question you didn't know you were asking. It's not magic or superstition. It's the unconscious trying to wake you up through symbolic signs. From this perspective, the outer universe acts as a mirror of your inner chaos. And that calls for a different kind of listening, no longer logical but symbolic. What do you feel when something strange happens? What part of you is being called to pay attention? The unconscious speaks through images, metaphors, symbols, not through arguments. And when reality aligns with your inner state in an improbable way, maybe it's not chance speaking but your psyche shouting. This phenomenon is both poetic and unsettling, because it forces us to leave the role of victims of chance and take on the active role of interpreters. What wants to be born in me now? What aspect of my life am I ignoring that needs a deeper look? When you start paying attention to the signs, you realize that life is more dialogical than it seemed. That it responds but only when you ask with an open heart. Synchronicity invites us to leave rigid rationality behind and enter a more fluid, intuitive sensitivity. It's not about obsessively seeking meaning in everything, but about learning to recognize when an event resonates with your soul, like an echo from within. And sometimes, that echo carries the exact key you needed for an insight, a healing, a turning point. Because when the unconscious manifests through the world, it's actually offering a chance to reconnect with who you are. Real self-knowledge requires going through pain, shame, and the loss of illusions. You're afraid to know yourself not because it's abstract but because deep down, you already sense what you'll find. There are parts of you you've spent your whole life trying to avoid. Unspoken thoughts, denied feelings, uncomfortable truths. Truly knowing yourself means stripping away all the certainties carefully built to protect your self-image. It means accepting that maybe you're not as good as you'd like, but also much more whole than you imagine. What if everything you believe about yourself is just a defense? A structure built to keep pain under control, to hide vulnerability, to keep the past asleep? The human mind is a specialist in building narratives that keep us feeling safe. But at the same time, those narratives become prisons. Living inside them is comfortable but empty. When you start dismantling those beliefs, you feel fear. Fear of not knowing who you are without them. But only then does the possibility of freedom begin. There is a mourning inherent in self-knowledge. You have to let go of the idealized version of yourself to make room for what's true. That hurts. It requires passing through layers of shame, not for being who you are, but for having hidden for so long. But once you go through that tunnel, something is reborn. Something simpler, more raw, more real. You no longer have to perform. You can just be. And that inner permission is one of the deepest forms of healing. Self-knowledge, therefore, is not a spiritual accessory. It's an act of courage. A radical commitment to truth even if it hurts. Even if it temporarily destroys the ground you used to walk on. Because in the end what emerges is a new center. A more authentic self, less programmed, more connected to life as it is, not as you wish it were. And only those who walk that path know, the pain is worth it. Every tear is worth it. Because that's where you find yourself. The more you try to control life, the more you become a slave to what you're trying to avoid. The pursuit of control is often the modern disguise for an ancient fear. Fear of loss, of suffering, of rejection, of being unworthy. We try to control routines, people, emotions, the future. As if rigidity could protect us from the unpredictable. But paradoxically, it's that very control that makes us sick. Because living with the need to predict everything means living in a constant state of tension. The soul can't breathe where there's no room for uncertainty. What you call organization might actually be emotional surveillance. What you call focus might be avoidance. And what you call responsibility might secretly be fear of disappointing others. Not that control is useless, it has its practical function. But when it becomes obsession, we're facing an unconscious attempt to deny vulnerability. The problem is, denying vulnerability is also denying life. Because to live, by definition, is to be exposed. The attempt to control everything reveals how much we are being controlled internally. By fear, by trauma, by complexes. And that's why, often when things get out of our control, we feel a disproportionate collapse. Because we're not just dealing with an event. We're dealing with the shattering of an illusion that kept us emotionally protected. That shattering can be painful, yes. But it can also be the beginning of a new freedom. The freedom not to have to pretend omnipotence. Letting go of control doesn't mean surrendering to chaos. It means accepting that true security doesn't come from mastering the world, but from trusting your ability to navigate whatever comes. When you understand that, fear transforms. It doesn't disappear, but it loses the power to paralyze you. And in that space of openness, something lighter can emerge. Something more alive, more spontaneous. Because only those who release control can truly experience life as it is, imperfect, unpredictable, and profoundly rich. Being yourself isn't about being different, it's about integrating what you've split. Individuation, for Jung, isn't about becoming special, it's about becoming whole. It's about no longer living fragmented between what you show and what you hide, between what you want and what you've learned to want. It's an inner alignment process where all parts, light and shadow, reason and instinct, persona and essence, look each other in the eye and acknowledge, we are one. And that's not easy, but it's real. The path is solitary, yes. Not because you need to isolate yourself, but because no one can do this work for you. Individuation is a deep dive, where each step reveals a new layer of yourself. You may walk alongside others, but the territory you'll travel within is unique. And sometimes that's exhausting. It's scary. But it's also empowering. Because with every new integration you feel more centered. Less dependent on others' approval. More intimate with your own truth. Many confuse individuation with eccentricity, as if being authentic were only about standing out. But true distinction doesn't come from trying to be different. It comes from internal coherence. From the serenity of no longer needing to prove anything. From the quiet confidence of someone who is whole inside. And this state isn't achieved through formulas or speeches. It's built brick by brick, choice by choice, in the intimacy of your own conflicts. To be whole is to accept that you are multiple, and that there's nothing wrong with that. It's to stop trying to be coherent for others and start being honest with yourself. It's to live less as a character and more as a presence. Because in the end, it's not about becoming something. It's about remembering who you always were before you learned to split. And this reunion doesn't make you superior. It makes you human. Jung didn't want you to defeat your shadows, but to embrace them. You don't need to conquer the unconscious, you need to dance with it. This metaphor reveals deep wisdom. The psyche isn't a machine to be fixed, but an orchestra to be listened to. And in that orchestra there are sounds that enchant you. And others you'd rather not hear. But they're all yours. They all make up the unique symphony of your existence. Repressing doesn't solve anything. What heals is attentive listening, presence without judgment. Freedom lies in stopping the escape from yourself. Running requires constant effort, constant tension, drained energy. And still, what's repressed remains there, waiting for an opening to emerge. The paradox is that the more you try to control or eliminate a part of you, the stronger it becomes in the soul's underground. The dance with the unconscious, on the other hand, proposes movement. It proposes acceptance without passivity. A courageous yes to the complexity of being human. This posture isn't complacency. It's maturity. It's stepping out of the internal battlefield and entering a field of dialogue. It's asking anger what it wants to tell you, sadness what it came to heal, fear what it's trying to protect. When you listen with openness, the symptom becomes a symbol. Repetition becomes learning. Chaos becomes a path. That's when the unconscious stops being an enemy and becomes a teacher. As Heraclitus said, what opposes, composes. And maybe that's one of the greatest lessons of the inner life. You don't enlighten yourself by fighting the darkness, but by embracing it with awareness. The dance with the unconscious isn't perfect. Sometimes it's messy, out of tune, intense. But it's precisely in that imperfection that the beauty lies. Because it's there, in the encounter with what you tried to avoid, that your most authentic freedom lives. In the end, the greatest enemy of our freedom isn't the world out there. It's what we ignore within. The illusion of control, the fear of the unknown, the masks we wear and forget to take off. All of this keeps us going in circles, thinking we're moving forward. But when you start to dance with your unconscious and not fight against it, something changes. Life stops being a script and becomes an encounter. This video isn't an answer. It's an invitation. For you to observe your patterns with more honesty, question your truths with more courage, and listen to your silences with more attention. What part of you has been secretly running your story? What do you need to integrate to finally stop dividing yourself? If this journey awakens something in you, share in the comments. What part of your shadow do you feel is ready to emerge? And what still scares you about this dive? Let's keep this dialogue going. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, the content isn't made to entertain, it's made to transform.